This webinar is being hosted by the Coordinating Center of the Resource Centers for Minority Aging Research at UCLA. With funding from the Coordinating Center works to support the efforts of our RICMAR sites across the country and to disseminate processes, tools, and results that can positively impact the health of diverse older adults in the United States. Welcome to our webinar today on planning for compliance with CONSORT requirements in clinical trials. Next slide. As a land-grant institution, UCLA and the RICMAR Coordinating Center acknowledges our presence on the traditional ancestral territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We hope you can take a minute to acknowledge the ancestral land you are currently on. The staff at the Coordinating Center work really hard to provide you with updated information about opportunities and resources related to aging in diverse communities. So we invite you to visit our website regularly for updates and announcements and to follow us on social media. Next slide. Just a few reminders before we begin. Please note that we are on Zoom webinar for today's session. This means that we can't hear you or see you. So please take to introduce yourself using the chat function by entering your name and your institutional affiliation. This will give our speaker a sense of who's in the audience. Thanks. Also, our presenter this morning will be pausing to take your questions throughout her presentation. So feel free to enter your questions or comments into the chat. We will also have time for Q&A at the end. And know that we will be distributing today's slides to registered participants and posting the recording of this session on our website. We have a great presentation in store for you today, and I'm sure some of you already have some questions that you'd like to ask our speaker. So please take advantage of the chat function throughout the presentation. Next slide. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Naina Harawa, Professor and Resident in the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA and with the Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science. It's great to welcome her back to the RICMAR family, as she was the former associate director for the center. Harawa leads Drew's HIV research pillar, also known as the Drew Center for AIDS Research, Education, and Services, or Drew Cares. Trained in epidemiology, Dr. Harawa's research involves understanding trends in HIV and other sexually transmitted infections and developing effective, culturally relevant interventions for prevention, care, and treatment. She has conducted innovative research with a variety of populations, including high-risk African American men, sexually active African American and Latina women, older adults, and incarcerated and post-incarcerated men. Much of her work has involved partnering with local governmental and community organizations in order to address health issues in populations that experience major health disparities. Welcome, Dr. Harawa. Feel free to share your slides.
Good morning, Dr. Guerrero, and thank you for that introduction. It's great to be here today. I'll share my slides. So my talk today, I want to just spend a moment saying that my talk today comes from a very specific place. I came into interventions and I'm doing intervention research with a background as an epidemiologist who had worked primarily in HIV, and much of that work was observational. Much of what epidemiologists do is observational research. But about 16 years ago, and I also always time my intervention work by my daughter because I wrote the grant for my first intervention study while she was pregnant, and I found out that we had gotten the grant while I was on maternity leave. And it partnered with somebody who was an interventionist and started doing more intervention type work, behavioral interventions around HIV prevention, and then later now access to care and biomedical prevention for HIV. Because of that background, I wasn't part of a research lab or didn't have the same type of sort of introduction to clinical trials research that some of you may have. But I learned a lot of things along the way, some of which I learned the hard way. And part of my goal today is that for those of you who are early in your work and either doing or interested in doing any type of intervention research, that you don't have to learn as many things the hard way as I did. So the CONSORT requirements come from a very specific place, and they were based on research and observations that a lot of clinical trials had been conducted and reported in ways that did not fully show what needed to be shown in order to understand whether or not the interventions were truly effective, for whom those interventions might be effective, and what limitations there were in this type of design. So as we all know, and as most of us are taught, randomized trials are considered a gold standard for evaluating really any type of intervention, but particularly health interventions, which is what we're interested in. But even they can yield biased results if they do not have methodological rigor. And I would argue that even the best done randomized controlled trial is going to have some sort of limitations. So the CONSORT requirements were developed to ensure that the readers of a published report on a trial had complete, clear, and transparent information on how the trial was done, the findings, and basically could then make an informed decision of the implications of those findings. And I'll share with you the references to these guidelines, but they provide pretty striking details of the limitations of many published reports on clinical trials that clearly show that this type of guidelines were necessary. So I share here this quote from Professor Doug Altman, who points out that all of us are doing work ultimately to benefit society, but to do that, the research, we don't just want to do research, we want to do it well. And so following these guidelines are really recommendations for doing that as well as possible. So this term CONSORT is not one we use too much in the US, but I went back to look it up, actually, the actual definition of the term, because I always thought of it as meaning partner, and that is one of the definitions, but the actual kind of first definition is basically the spouse of a monarch. But of course, we're not here talking about the spouse of a monarch, we're talking about an acronym for CONSORT, which basically stands for Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials. And basically, these standards encompass various initiatives that were developed by the CONSORT group to alleviate some of the problems that I just talked about related to randomized trials. I also want to say that, pretty much most of what I describe here, I pulled from articles that you can find on the CONSORT Trials website. I fully admit that this is not particularly original, and if you wonder about the changes in the spellings, it's because some of it is a British spelling and some of it is my American spelling, although I was born in a former British colony, so I probably am a little bit, that may be a little bit of why, but I was mainly just copying and pasting, but I will bring to this a lot of my learned experience for doing this kind of work. So there are two main components to the CONSORT recommendations. One is a 25-item checklist, and I will be discussing the items on those checklists. But one of the things I want to point out is that these guidelines have been adopted by many, many different journals. And so when you go to publish the results on any type of clinical trial, so there are some journals, there's generally the expectation of compliance with these requirements. And there are some journals that actually ask you to complete the checklist and submit it along with your publication. So it's really useful early in when you're setting up your trial to look at that checklist and ensure that you're collecting all of the information so that you can do that when you do go to publish. The other key component to these CONSORT recommendations is a flow diagram. And this is probably what people are most familiar with because we see this in many different published reports. And it basically displays the progress of all of the participants through a clinical trial. So the first two components to the, and I'll give you a reason. Obviously, there's 4 components listed here, but the first two components to the original well, I should say they were revised in 2010. CONSORT recommendations refer to the title and the abstract. The reason I have 4 components on this slide is because there has been an extension of the CONSORT guidelines specific to health equity. So I wanted to ensure, given the focus of the RICMARs, that I also talk about those. One of the first recommendations is a simple one, and that's that if it's a randomized trial, that it be specifically described as such in the title of the article that reports on the outcomes itself. And then the second really goes into guidelines for the abstract, which of course is a structured summary, and they recommend that ideally people use a structured approach to abstracts that would include sections of the trial design, methods, results, and conclusions. And they actually provide some interesting arguments saying that in general, structured abstracts tend to be better, more complete, easier to understand, etc. So of course, anytime we publish a research article, we have to go with the guidelines of the journal that we're working with. But I think that this guideline is still a useful one to think about, because even if ultimately our abstract doesn't have these little paragraphs for design, methods, results, and conclusions, starting out writing it that way may still lead to a better abstract than if we just write it as a paragraph, especially when we're reporting on a trial. The 2 extensions for health equity that are described suggest specifically that the abstract itself presents results of all planned health equity analyses. So if one's doing a trial that specifically has some type of health equity goals, then ideally would have pre-specified some analyses specific to that, and they basically suggest that those are reported in the abstract. And then they also recommend that the extent and limits of applicability of the findings to populations of interest are also described in the abstract. And they specifically talk about progress plus characteristics, which most of us would basically describe as sociodemographic characteristics, but I will describe those a little bit more on the next slide. So progress is used to define socially stratifying factors, and we mainly think of these as social determinants of health, things like where people live, their race, ethnicity, language, their occupation, educational status, SES. Progress Plus was basically expanded to describe additional characteristics, things like age, disability, perhaps features of relationships between people. For example, if one was studying people that were excluded from school or say living with a disability, that all of these might be important to also point out in terms of a population that one's looking at and important considerations in terms of health equity. And then part of the rationale for attention to Progress Plus characteristics is that these might represent disadvantage based on social, cultural, and of course, oftentimes temporal context. And I'll also return to this idea of temporal context later when we get to some of the other recommendations. So I want to talk just a little bit about the abstract, and then I'll stop and see if there's any questions. So they provide even more detail as to what ideally should be included in the abstract. Of course, some of this is more just in the title page or the additional information, such as the authors, who is the author and the corresponding author's information. They point out that one should indicate not just that it is a randomized trial, but the specific type of randomized trial that it is. For example, is it a parallel randomized trial? Are you looking at actually trying to assess whether one intervention is superior to another, or is it a non-inferiority trial where you're comparing a new intervention to an existing one and establishing is it not worse than or not inferior to? And then they provide quite a bit of detail for what you should include in terms of the methods, how you should talk about the participants, the interventions that were used for each group, of course, the objectives or the hypotheses, clearly defining what was the primary outcome. Oftentimes our studies may have more than one outcome, but the primary outcome should be clearly defined in the abstract. something about how people were allocated or how they were randomized to interventions, and then who was blinded. And I'll also return to the concept of blinding a little bit more. You should indicate the number of people that were randomized to each of your study groups, regardless of how many there were, the status of the trial, the number of people were actually analyzed, and then if there were any, of course, we're looking at the outcomes, which is generally looking at the effectiveness of the intervention, but if there were important adverse events or side effects, those should also be mentioned in the abstract. And the authors really point out that, we're in such an information age, and so oftentimes people don't get further than the abstract, and there may be clinicians that are literally looking at an abstract in order to make a decision about clinical care. So it's important to have as many of these key details in the abstract as possible. So I see a lot of stuff in the chat. I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions.
No questions yet, Nina. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Continue.
Great. Well, feel free to type them in if you do have questions. Thank you. So now the interjection recommendations are actually fairly simple and self-explanatory. Of course, we want to talk about the scientific background and clearly indicate the rationale for this particular study, given what is known about interventions in the area of research that you're looking at. What's the rationale for testing this particular intervention with the particular population that you're looking at? And then specifying the objectives or hypotheses being tested. Not surprisingly, it's in the methods that the CONSORT requirements or recommendations get a lot more detailed. So I will be spending a fair amount of time talking about the methods. As I indicated when I talked about the abstract, they want you to be as specific as possible about the type of randomized trial that's being done, and to include in this the allocation ratio. Are people allocated 1-to-1 to each of the interventions? Is it 2-to-1 or some other type of ratio that people are allocated to the intervention groups? Any changes that occurred to the methods after a trial were commenced should be articulated. And of course, this is one of the things that is less than fun to have to talk about the changes that happen. But almost any study, there will be some changes over the course of it. So those should be highlighted. In terms of participants, not only should the eligibility criteria should be described, but also where it is that people were recruited from, what were those specific settings, and how it was that they were approached. Was it that they were approached? Was it that they learned about the opportunity to be at a trial through a clinician who was treating them and then had the opportunity to join? Did they learn about it through an ad on the internet, et cetera, et cetera? Along with those settings and approaches, often the data themselves are collected in a different setting, so that should be described. And then in the extension for health equity, one of the things that they argue, and not all of us, but many of us who do health equity research are doing some level of community partnered research. And so this is one of the places where some details about those partnerships with the populations, with communities, should actually be discussed and clarified. It's important, of course, to describe the interventions, and here we need to describe the interventions ideally with sufficient detail to allow replication. Although I will, kind of talk about an exception here. The interventions that I've done have been behavioral interventions. The manuals for implementing them are several dozen pages, and so it's not that in a manuscript I can provide sufficient details for replication. But I at least have the details on the length of the intervention sessions, who's delivering the intervention sessions, what are the types of modules, what is the theory on which those intervention sessions are based, so that if then somebody had the manual about the content, they would also be able to replicate all of those other aspects of the interventions themselves. In terms of outcome measures and the methods one needs to discuss, what analyses were pre-specified for both the primary and secondary outcomes, and then both how and when in the trials those outcomes were assessed. And it's very important here that people ideally use some type of standardized measures or scales for looking at your primary and secondary outcomes, and that in the reporting of that in your methods, that the sources for those standardized scales and ideally their psychometric properties or other properties are described. I will say here, though, as well, that many of us who are doing health equity research or research on minority populations that have maybe not had the same level of attention within health research, that sometimes it's difficult to find an outcome measure that has been well tested in the populations that we're looking at. I've certainly had that experience with in some of my research working with bisexual African-American men, for example, and myself and community partners would look at some of the instruments for those populations and really have some questions as to whether or not they were culturally relevant. So, I would really recommend here that people attempt to find something that's culturally relevant for their population that has actually been tested in their population. And then if you can't, work to develop work to adapt an existing measure for your population and use that, but have some, follow, there's, existing guidelines, and Dr. Ron Hayes, who's part of the RICMAR, has published information as well as, I believe, YouTube videos where he talks about some of the guidelines about how you can do that adaptation. So again, it's ideal to use an existing well-tested measure, but if you can't do that, go through a well-reasoned process for developing one for your population, ideally adapting from something that has been well established. And then finally here they talk about changes as well in 6B, that if there were changes in the trial outcomes after the commencement of the trial, those should be described as well as the reasons for making those changes. And I wanted to stop here because if you'll notice on these methods, twice they talk about changes after a study starts. And these are the things I feel as researchers we want to avoid at all costs. But I've learned over time that it's also really important to be flexible. And one of the things that was reassuring to me in going back over these CONSORT guidelines is they had a statistic that when they compared protocols to publications of 102 randomized trials, they found that 62% of the trials had at least one primary outcome that was changed, introduced, or omitted compared to the protocol. So it's not uncommon that when we get into doing our research, we find that for whatever reason, the outcomes that we wanted to assess, there may be some problem. The eligibility criteria that we had may be too narrow or perhaps too broad. And we don't want to make those changes. It's not ideal to make those changes, but it's often necessary. And I would actually encourage people, when they start to feel that that's necessary, to actually sit down with your co-investigators in your team and consider it earlier than later. I've certainly been in a situation where the writing started to be on the wall that was what needed to happen, but because I didn't want to have to make the change, we waited longer than ideally we should have, and ultimately it hurt our enrollment numbers, that delay in making those changes. So there's a lot more, of course, in terms of methods. Not only should you talk about how many people were in your study, but it's really important that you indicate what was your planned sample size and how was that determined. In other words, the power calculations for determining how many people were intended to be in your trial. What interim analyses were done. Many trials, especially of things like medications or vaccines, will have pre-planned interim analyses and stopping guidelines. So if a trial was stopped early, it's important that you indicate what those stopping guidelines were and why it was stopped. In terms of the randomization, and I'll go into this in more details, but that you should indicate how you generated your random sequence, what type of randomization was involved. Was a simple randomization, or was there some sort of blocking done? Was the randomization done within strata of some sort of characteristic of your study population? There's many other aspects to the randomization as well, though. Key one is, what was the mechanism used to implement the random sequence? In other words, once you had your random sequence, did the research assistants need to call to a central number to get the next random assignment, or were they opening opaque envelopes to identify what was the next random assignment? And what were the steps taken to conceal that so that people did not know ahead of time, either participants or the people enrolling participants did not know ahead of time what would be the next allocation in the random sequence. Part of the description of the randomization should also indicate who generated the random sequence, who enrolled participants, and who was it that actually assigned participants to one intervention arm or another. Next, they talk about blinding. If there was blinding, again, I've done, all my interventions have been behavioral, and so people know what intervention group they're in, so I have not been involved specifically with blinding, but be happy to hear if anybody has something to say about blinding. But it's important that you indicate who was blinded. Often we use the terms double-blinded, triple-blinded, but those are actually defined differently in different textbooks and in different articles. So it's important, it's fine to use those terms, but one should also indicate specifically who was and was not blinded. And in cases where part of the blinding process involves creating interventions that look very similar, for example, similar injections or similar pills, then that also needs to be described so readers can assess, okay, you attempted to blind, but are they really convinced that the blinding was effective? And then finally, in your description of the statistical methods, you should describe the methods that were used for both your primary and your secondary outcomes. And then for any additional analyses, such as subgroup or adjusted analyses, of course, those should be described as well. Do we have any questions yet?
Nina, there is a question in the chat about addressing the inability to reach a predetermined sample size, and it's also a good time to give you a time check.
Sure. So the inability to actually reach a predetermined sample size? Yeah. So
the chat question specifically is, do you have any questions on how to address the inability to reach the predetermined sample size in a feasibility randomized control trial due to COVID?
Yeah, I think so many of us are having that challenge. I haven't had to write this up because of COVID yet, but I've certainly been in that situation before where we didn't reach our predetermined sample size. And I think part of you'll see there's a thread through the CONSORT guidelines, which are really about transparency. And so one needs to indicate, what was it that was your predetermined sample size? Of course, where did you get, and what were, the brief summary of the reasons that you didn't get it. There will be many, many, many people who are in this boat because of COVID. And so, I think all we can do is be honest that that's where we were at. And, at some point the money runs out or the time runs out for doing a study, but there's still been a huge investment in the research and the data that were collected. And even if you didn't reach your sample size, there still may be something of value that can be learned. So I would just suggest being direct and transparent about it. So there's a lot of steps related to randomization, and I'm not going to go into these in detail, but just to kind of lay out that all of these need to be described. I kind of hinted at them more generally in the overall description. I also wanted to just put out a method that I've used that isn't talked about much, but may be an option, especially if you're doing certain types of behavioral interventions. Generally, almost always people are randomized after they're fully consented into an intervention. But I am currently running an intervention that involves incentives for doing certain health-related behaviors. And because of that, people in the intervention group basically have the opportunity to earn a lot more money being part of the intervention than people in the control group. And the interventions themselves is also fairly complicated. And so there actually is a method that's been, established in the literature where one option is that you give people general information as you're enrolling them in the study, but you actually have your consent forms, different consent forms for the intervention and control group, and people don't know what group they're in until they basically open the consent form and read it. And so they get the full description of whichever group they're assigned to. Of course, then they have the option not to enroll, but they don't spend all this time reading about the details of these two different interventions and also realizing, oh, well, the intervention group could have earned a lot more money and I've been assigned to the control, where, of course, there could be dissension related to that. And so it's not that we hide that there's a difference, but we just don't spend a lot of time going into a description of the difference after or in the process of enrolling people. As I said, there has been blinding terminology that we often use, double, triple blind, is useful, but it's really key that people indicate specifically who was blinded. There was a study of 200 randomized trials in which they found 18 different combinations of people who were actually blinded when they used these terms. So, even trials that report as double blind that did not blind participants and healthcare providers, et cetera. So indicate who was and was not blinded. Here's just a description of how someone might talk about their statistical methods. Pre-specified subgroup analyses according to antioxidant assignment, presence or absence of prior CVD, and then other different aspects of participants were performed using Cox proportional hazard models, and these were analyzed using baseline exposure assessments and restricted to participants with non-missing subgroup data at baseline. So now we've finally gotten through a lot of details of the methods, just to talk a little bit about the results. As I said, this participant flow diagram is one of the key aspects of the CONSORT requirements, and that at minimum they indicate for each group how many people were randomly assigned, received the intervention, and were analyzed for your primary outcomes. They should indicate losses and exclusions after randomization together with reasons. And this is one of the things that's important to set up a process for collecting along the way so that later you're not trying to figure out, oh, okay, this person was lost because they didn't want to be in the study anymore, and this person was lost because we couldn't find them, et cetera. All those reasons are things you should be tracking along the way. The dates for both when it was that people were recruited, but also when it was that the intervention was being implemented, because of course that context over time may have different implications. If the trial was ended or stopped ahead of time, that should be indicated. And then, of course, you're going to have your table 1, which basically shows your baseline demographic and clinical characteristics for each group. And here, this just describes a little bit more about this, the flow diagram, and I'll show an image of it on the next page. The thing I didn't talk about on the last slide, which is more of a guideline than a requirement, is the first one. They basically suggest that ideally you should not just have who was randomized for each group, but information about who was evaluated for potential enrollment. People who were approached to see if they were interested in being in the study, how many people were screened and eligible, and of those, how many actually enrolled. And they basically say the rationale for that is it helps one to determine whether people in the trial were likely representative of all of the patients or clients seen in a particular venue from which they were recruited. So here you can see what this flow diagram looks like and the process through the phases of a randomized trial. This is just a 2-group parallel design, and you can basically see for each of those things that I just described what it might look like. I should point out that one would need one of these follow-up boxes for each of your follow-up time points. So if you had like a 3- and a 6-month follow-up, you should have a box for each of those with the information included in this diagram. So now finally we're to the more meat of the results, of course, why we're doing all of this research, which is actually talking about our outcomes. but included in that, you should actually indicate for each of your analyses, how many people in each of your intervention groups were included in the analyses. Many times we have missing data for whatever reason, and so so the number of people included in different analyses might differ, and either your tables or your descriptions should indicate that clearly, along with the results for each group, and an estimate of the effect size and the precision of that effect size. I strongly encourage people, and the authors do as well, to use confidence intervals as opposed to doing just strict p-values and limiting it to that, because the confidence intervals provide a lot more information, and they avoid some of the challenges associated with p-values. We also have more and more journals that actually encourage people to limit use of p-values and strict kind of p-value testing, where you're only relying on an arbitrary cutoff for determining whether or not an outcome is important. Of course, here as well, you're going to include any other ancillary analyses and indicate whether these were things that were planned ahead of time or determined post hoc after looking at your data or learning things along the way. And the extension for health equity specifically encourages that you describe details of the implementation in each arm. So if you look at part of the flow diagram is indicating not just who was followed up, but who actually got the intervention among those who were assigned. And so if we have different groups that we're considering and have concerns about health equity, we would want to describe that separately for our groups. Because of course, if a minoritized group was less likely to actually complete the intervention, then that's an important thing to consider and talk about. And finally, it's of course important to talk about important harms or unintended effects that were identified in each group. So there's a greater discussion on this in the website, but part of what they talk about is that you should indicate whether or not information on adverse events was collected, how they were defined or identified, whether or not they were attributed to the interventions themselves. Of course, adverse events happen. Oftentimes they're not related to the intervention, so a process of describing how one attributed them to the intervention needs to be indicated. And then, of course, if there are any significant important adverse events, one should describe the absolute risk of those events for each of the groups. And finally, include a balanced discussion of benefits and harms, because there may be harms that are significant, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily want to throw out an intervention that's beneficial. So now moving on to the discussion, of course, we always talk about our limitations. One of the things I would encourage for junior scholars is, we know that this is important, but a sort of somewhat common thing I think I've seen in people's writing, and remember from my own writing, is that we tend to sometimes beat ourselves over the head with our limitations. All studies have limitations, but it's important to have a balanced description so that we describe those in the context of the benefits of the study. We want to talk about the generalizability of our findings, and then include an interpretation. One of the biggest places we get in trouble in our publications is if our interpretation moves too far away from our results. So of course that's key, that they're always tracking back to our results, that we're balancing out our description of benefits and harms, and then taking into account other relevant evidence. I'm sharing here a outline that the Annals of Internal Medicine basically encourages its authors to use in terms of their discussion. I think writing a discussion is another art that really takes a while as a junior investigator to learn, and to be able to move beyond just a summary of the results, to a real putting the results in some sort of context for the reader, and moving beyond them in a way that really goes to implications and context. And so they basically encourage you to have, of course, that synopsis, but then a consideration of the possible mechanisms and explanations for why your intervention maybe worked or didn't work as well as you thought. Of course, putting in the context of other published research, talking about the limitations, which I already mentioned, And then finally, summarizing what are the clinical, and I've included here policy and practice implications of the work and the research implications. And I think as we move more and more to translational science, including something about policy and practices becomes more and more important, because of course that's how we move from these wonderful interventions that get published, but then oftentimes later don't get to populations, is by really starting to think through that kind of T3 to T4 aspect of our work. External validity and talking about that, or generalizability, of course, is part of our discussion. And one of the things that the CONSORT guidelines authors point out is that doing a good job of that really harkens back to the importance of the specific CONSORT guidelines. In other words, one can't talk well about generalizability if they haven't really described who was eligible for the study and what was the setting and the location in which the study was done. If they haven't described both the intervention and how it was administered, if they haven't defined the outcomes well, or really clarified what was the period of follow-up and recruitment. So all of these things that you addressed earlier on are part of then talking about the external validity, the generalizability of your findings. Here's what I think is a lovely example, and I'm going to stop and take questions in just a minute. That's a nice example of discussing external validity. First, they discuss the unique contribution, basically saying this replicates and extends the work of Clark and colleagues and demonstrates that this cognitive behavioral prevention program can be reliably and effectively delivered in different settings by clinicians outside of the group who originally developed the intervention. Then they placed it in the context of the existing research. They said the effect size was consistent with those of previously reported single-site indicated depression prevention studies and was robust across sites with respect to both depressive disorders and symptoms. And then they point out that they used a comparison condition that's relevant to public health. They use this usual care comparison condition. And then finally, in terms of really extending this study population to others, they go on to say that the sample was predominantly working class to middle class, people who had access to health insurance, given evidence that this type of therapy can be more efficacious for adolescents from homes with higher incomes. It's important to test the effects of this prevention program with a more economically and ethnically diverse sample. So I want to stop and see if there's any questions before I move on to the last kind of aspects.
There's no questions in the chat, Nina. Go ahead, and you have 15 minutes left.
Okay. The next parts are a little bit quicker. So it's really key that any type of intervention, even if it's not a randomized trial, but any type of intervention is registered somewhere. In the US, the standard place for doing that is in clinicaltrials.gov. There you will get a registration number, and both that number and the name of the trial registry should be included in your manuscript, and is often now required for reporting to IRBs and to NIH if your study is funded by NIH. Ideally, in your manuscript, you should indicate where a full trial protocol can be accessed, if available, and so that there's a number of different places where you can do that I'll talk about shortly. And of course, you should indicate the funding, who funded your study, and what was the role of funders. If the funders did have any potential influence on how the study was done or the results, of course, that needs to be indicated because there's potential conflicts of interest related to that. There's a number of options or resources for publishing study protocols. Sometimes the journals and their supplementary online information will allow you to do it. There are at least two journals, people may know of others, but JMIR, the Journal of Medical Internet Research and Trials, and both of these actually publish in the published literature clinical trial protocols. And it's a great way to be able to get a publication early in your study, even before you started collecting data. And then you can also just make it available via email request. I want to talk just a little bit more about health equity and and some of these recommendations from the equity extension guidelines. And one of the things that you'll see is that there have been a number of extensions of these CONSORT guidelines to other types of trials. And so the equity extension is one. There are some to like crossover trials, that kind of crossover design. There are ones for cluster randomized trials. So I would encourage you to not only look at the general guidelines, but also look to see if there's been one more specific to the type of trial that you're involved in. So I've already talked about some of the additional guidelines related to this equity extension. They're basically 16 sort of either extensions or modifications. And now I just want to talk about some of the modifications, because I talked about the additional ones, but here they have some kind of modifications that I didn't incorporate earlier. So in the introduction, where you talk about your scientific background and your rationale for your study, they basically suggest that you actually have a specific rationale for your focus on health equity. Here's one example. The present study targeted a street-based population of African-American female sex workers who are disconnected from healthcare services and who had very high levels of competing needs. We hypothesized that the addition of a peer case manager would increase the efficaciousness of the strength-based case management intervention for this high-risk group of women. So the rationale for this is that you have a trial that's focusing on answering a question relevant to health equity, and your background is now really highlighting why it's so important for doing this intervention in this setting and with this population. And I provide another example below, but I'm going to move on since I'm getting a little close to time. In the methods, as I said, we should talk about the settings and locations, and also talk, if we're interested in health equity, to talk more about the context of those settings and how that context might contribute to health inequities in the population that we're focusing on. So in this example, the authors basically said, rural Thane district was selected, the specific health district was selected to be the setting due to its prevalence of high and early fertility, low contraceptive use, high unmet needs for family planning, and limited access to government health services. The area is also characterized by high representation of tribal communities. So now the reader really has an understanding of, not just the people, but the community in which this study was done. Not just the name of the community, but actually something about the context of the community. As I indicated earlier, they encourage you, if you're looking at health equity, to have your progress or your patient flow diagram divided by those groups that you might want to look at separately. So in this specific example, it's stratified by males and females. So we have the same diagram, but then one could look for the male and female participants in this trial, whether there were differences in the proportion that actually received the allocation, in the proportions that were followed up, in the proportions that were analyzed. And so that might give some nuance and context for the readers that otherwise would be missed if everyone was just put together. And then the last extension for health equity that I want to talk about, as I said, I didn't cover all of them, but the last one really relates to ethics. And, generally in our reports now, more and more journals ask us to indicate what was the institutional review board or the process that we went to for approvals for our research. But here they actually describe that you should actually go beyond that and talk about sort of other aspects of ethical clearance. And so in this particular study, they indicate that, yes, they had this official approval from the Boston University IRB, but in addition, they got administrative approval from the mayor of the town of Ambalavayo, and that mayor was responsible for the villages in the district, and they also got approval from the medical inspector of this district and who is a local official in charge of all health-related activities in the district. Some of my research has involved people who are incarcerated, and so it's a requirement, but one of the things that I've now started to talk about explicitly, that the Institutional Review Board that approved this research included a prisoner representative, so that we know that people who actually have real knowledge or lived experience related to that very specific context, and a context in which there's a lot of opportunity for abuse, unfortunately, of study subjects, were part of the approval process. So that's one example from my own research. Here's another example from some international research that was done. So I do hope we have time for some more questions. I want to just provide at the end some of the specific references that I'm talking about. As I've said, these guidelines have now been adopted by multiple different medical journals. So more and more, it's an expectation that you have complied with them in thinking through both how you designed your study and collected your data, but also in your reporting on the study. There have been extensions, and these aren't the only extensions, but as I said, there's been extensions to other types of trials, so cluster randomized trials, and trials that use adaptive designs, which have become also more and more common, and especially common in more translational type research. And then finally, they've extended the CONSORT statement to randomized trials of non-pharmacological treatments. And so you can look there for references and a discussion of that. So I'd be happy to see if people have more questions or comments.
Thanks, Nina. There is a question in the that was posed to you. How do you balance describing the protocol in your results paper when you have already published a protocol paper?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I don't think,
of course you can reference like C protocol paper, but there's got to be more to it than that, right? So how would you do it?
Sure. I think the way I would describe it I would add that sentence, but what I would put in the published paper with the outcomes would really be the same level of detail as if I hadn't published it. Generally, the protocol papers for those people who are super motivated to learn all those details, but many people don't fall into that category, but still will want the information they would generally expect to see in any other kind of report on a clinical trial that did not include, did not have a published protocol paper. So I would encourage you to just be as detailed as you would be otherwise.
Great. There's another question that's been submitted. So somebody is submitting a research protocol to a journal, but it's requiring them to submit the CONSORT checklist. In this case, do they submit what they have done, like sample size decisions, or what they plan to do?
I think I'm having trouble understanding this question, what you've done and what I've... Yes, but I feel like there's more to the question that I may be not quite understanding. You're saying just submit what I've done and what you plan to do. Yes, but I feel like is there more to this question?
Maybe we can have the participant add a little bit more. That's what they submitted. So I guess the question really revolves around what do you provide in terms of a CONSORT checklist when you are submitting your protocol to a journal?
Yeah, so the CONSORT checklist is pretty detailed, and mainly, I really went through all 25 of the items. And when I did this for a paper where we already had the findings, so this wasn't for, if you're saying you're submitting a research protocol paper, but in my case, where I've done this has been in studies where we already have, we're working, basically with the outcomes paper. So much of it was literally cutting and pasting things from the manuscript onto that checklist. So I think in the case of a research protocol paper, yeah, you're going to be talking about what it is that you've done already, because I assume maybe you're partway into your study, and what you plan to do. You don't have many of those. You're not going to be able to answer everything on the checklist because you don't have your results yet. You may be able to get to like a table 1 if everybody's been enrolled. You may be able to, there's many of those things beyond the methods that you can answer, but certainly not all of them. I guess I would say you'd have to say what you plan to do, and of course you can't list the actual results, et cetera, because you don't have those yet. Looks like you said exactly. Thank you for clarification.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? Feel free to submit them through the Q&A or through the chat.
Maybe one other small thing I would say as people are thinking is that, as I said, it's not required, but they encourage you to be able to describe who didn't end up in your study, but you tried to recruit. I think there's a couple reasons why that's useful in addition. One is that might be something of a paper itself, especially if you're working with a population where there's challenges for recruitment, in which you use some innovative strategy for recruitment, or in which, for whatever reason, you might later think that people who were recruited through one sort of pathway might have different results from another kind of pathway. So that information can be really useful. I will say there can be a bit of a challenge related to collecting some of those data, which is that it requires you to keep data on people who aren't enrolled in your study. And so generally my IRB, especially if I keep any kind of identifiers with that, generally my IRB has asked me to justify it. But it can also be helpful if you're in a situation where people might somehow inadvertently enroll or be screened twice. Having some level of identifiers is useful so you can weed that out of your data, or at least be able to document when people have potentially tried to enroll more than once. So I see a question here. Any suggestions on how to write the results of a clinical trial which included multiple methods? That is a great question. So qualitative and quantitative methods. I mean, I think so. When we do this in our grant proposals, when we are writing any kind of a mixed method grant proposal, we generally have a section for both. So oftentimes when I'm working on manuscripts, and and I think another suggestion I would have is you can do a lot of writing for a manuscript much earlier than maybe we perceive that we can, because we've written so much in our grant proposal. We've written a background, we've written our methods, et cetera. And so, I would start with literally, cutting and pasting and adapting some of those sections in. I think it may be challenging. However, I've certainly seen plenty of mixed method studies, but I feel like I have not seen many mixed method studies that for clinical trials that report both the qualitative and quantitative outcomes. I think that could be really rich, but I also think it could be challenging. So maybe one of the questions is, do you want to report those in a single paper? Can you do that and give it justice, especially given many of the journals that report clinical trials have much sort of stricter word counts than journals that don't. And so another consideration may be that you want those to be separate papers. But otherwise, I would just, say that you have some separate sections, that describe each. If you're going to be, if there's a greater emphasis on one than the other in your actual reporting, then those sections may be shorter or longer. But I'm sorry, I don't have more wisdom on that in particular. I actually would love to read that paper, though, that combines them both, because I feel so often when we read results of clinical trials, I often have questions that could be answered with the qualitative information. So I think that's very valuable. But I do think it might be challenging to find a good venue for that type of a publication.
Great. So it looks like there are no more questions, and with that, I would like to close out the webinar, and thank you everyone and Dr. Harawa for being with us today. And just want to remind you all that you'll receive a 2-minute survey at the end of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to give us your feedback. Also, I am going to type in the chat our next webinar next month with Dr. Erica Boone. She will be presenting on NIH Repays Your Student Loans, an in-depth overview of the NIH loan repayment programs. And you are eligible for registering early for staying on with us throughout this webinar. And so you should see that in the chat now. With that, I just want to thank again our presenter, Dr. Harawa, and our audience for participating, as well as the coordinating center staff for their leadership, and the NIH for funding our efforts. Please remember to visit our website, thericmar.org, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.